Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so we're ready now for some points or questions from the floor. I think we have a mic. Have we a mic going round? Is that, oh, we don't. So basically, I'll repeat the question anyway. That's great. So maybe we will have to raise our voices if we're going to sit at the table. But plenty of food for thought. Yes, sir. Yep, this gentleman. Sorry, hip at the post. Sorry, it's coming your way. Just behind you. Just behind you. Sorry. This gentleman in the back.
Very interesting, completely informative, there's no doubt about that. A lot of food for thought. My initial memory is not of Derry, but of Belfast in 1964. When Sinn Féin stood for elections. And it later became the Devil Street riots. And that was at a time on the heels of a failed 56 campaign. And the people behind that particular campaign, the Sinn Féin at that particular time, then split. There were different people. Some became professionals. Then the Republican clubs were formed just after that. And it seemed to be that, which you said, they were very lucky at one occasion, they were very unlucky on another occasion. The Sinn Féin of that particular time didn't need riots, even though they had no guns. They finished up with probably 7 more guns that weekend, taking off B specials, but I think they may have had one weapon coming from sources that I knew at that particular time, of which I was a very young boy. But anyway, that was my initial view, and realising that this was a very strange country. And it went on from then, and the understanding that an IRA of that particular time could stay on the border and say, no easy targets, no shooting people in Belfast, don't start sectarianism. Even they knew at that particular time that would start the civil war in the north of Ireland. And they're not the same as the Sinn Féin today. And they didn't have the following. And this sectarianism, this deep sectarianism, and I can concur with your conclusion at the end. Is it a failed entity? Shall we start over? But I think there should be an in-depth look at some of those people and why they made those decisions. People like here in Derry, Malachy McGurn, Willie McMillan, Daisy O'Hagan, Catherine, all come from the official side who probably split and had a lot of other people around them at that particular time who were in favour of harvest.
Sorry, would you like to respond, Emmet? Would you like to respond to that?
Pardon?
Would you like to respond?
Well, yeah, I would just say, that it's interesting that the border campaign was very much the product of Southern nationalism, and that had its advantages and disadvantages, but it really didn't connect with the Northern nationalist people at all, and and it was quite different to what happened after 1969. Yeah.
It was more of a function really of high unemployment, high immigration in the south, and the complete dejection, I suppose, at the failure of the anti-partition campaign, the Mansion House Committee and so on. Yeah. But it was crushed within really effectively a year, 18 months by internment north and south, and nothing happening in Belfast. And very few Northerners involved. There were some, but there were mainly, Sean Cronin, for example, who became the Irish Times American correspondent in the 80s, had been an Irish Army officer from Kerry, you know. Yeah. And there were lots of people like him. So it seemed to have very little relevance to the lives of Northern nationalists, post-welfare state, you know, who were having a very different experience to those in the rather poor New Republic declared in 1949. Would that be your feeling as well? Happy enough? Okay, there's a gentleman here who very cordially gave the mic to the man in front.
Hello. Sorry. I would like to make a comment that Greta made about the women of Derry. She's quite right, because I can think back to a place called Springtown Camp in Derry. There was a fire on the 31st of October 1959, and the whole family were looking to escape with their lives. But the next day, 19 Mallers from Springtown Camp, who in total had combined were Mallers to 128 kids, marched from Springtown Camp and to the Guildhall for a Londonderry Corporation housing meeting. And the reason why they were there was because that they were at the Springtown Camp in August of 1946, and it's supposed to last for 6 months, but it lasts for 21 years, 1 month and 21 days. It's a long 6 months. So the Mallers of Springtown Camp, we recognise them to be great women, also the same as the women of Derry. And something that you said yourself about the march in Guildhall. There was a march in Springtown Camp on Tuesday, the 28th of January 1964. 200 men and women marched 1.5 miles from Springtown Camp at the Guildhall, and is regarded in Derry. Certainly in Derry, it's the first civilized march ever in Derry, and probably in the north. So I think that needs to be recognised as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in one of those marches, maybe the first one you mentioned, they actually managed to secure the bungalows of Springtown Camp, didn't they? After the military had left, or was that earlier? There was a demand for housing, and the people in Springtown Camp forced really the council to give them tenancy agreements at that time. There's another gentleman just wanted to come in there. This gentleman here, maybe there's somebody at the back. We'll come back to you in a second. Finn Barr, I see.
Yeah, just on the woman's question. I mean, Goretti's correct. Women were very, very active, especially the factory girls. And many a story can be told there. The point is that in Derry, on the 9th of October, there was a meeting held in the City Hotel, which in those days was just across the street in the Guildhall. I boycotted that meeting because I felt that the people who had built up the movement, in other words, the Derry Unemployed and the Derry Housing Action Committee, and say people like the People's League, groups that are kind of unknown these days, not mentioned, that somehow they were being bypassed, and also felt as though some of them were my relatives, they were quite well-off Catholics, middle class. Poor people would consider me middle class now, but I was born in 134 Bogside, and I don't forget my roots. But on that night at the meeting, I'm going to keep this short. 50 odd years later, I was still like, how it was organised, that meeting. Because when people like me boycotted it, a lot of the women came along and said to me, I remember, I was a secretary of the Housing Action Committee and secretary of the Unemployed, and I was editor of the Housing Action Committee newsletter, Reality, and they were very annoyed that somehow they were being excluded. And I said, I agree with you 100%, I'm not attending that meeting. I was elected at that meeting in my absence. So what the main point I want to make is this, that the woman of Derry had no chance, I'm talking the working class woman of Derry, had no chance after the 9th of October of becoming as prominent in the movement as the men became. Because there wasn't one woman elected at that meeting. And the Bridget Bonds, the Nellie Gormleys, the Kathy Harkins, the Nell McCaffertys, did you imagine Nell in the committee, that should be a good crack. But the point was that if those women had been at that meeting that night, the woman of Derry would be much strongly represented. And the irony is this, we're fighting for one man, one vote. Well, the irony I found was there wasn't even one woman, one vote in the Derry Citizen Action Committee, and I ended up as secretary. But I'm not criticising those who were elected. In one ways, I am on a class basis, but the working class woman, in a whole lot of ways, were reluctant to come forward. We're actually doing a website now, and I still find it very hard to get women to come forward for that website. Okay, thank you.
This gentleman here in the green at the front. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, there's so much that we could go in here tonight. Just to comment on Emmet, talk about the Northern Ireland Military Congress of Trade Unions, the Northern Ireland Labour Party at that time. I had the facility of reading some of those papers. I worked with Congress for 30 years, so I was able to see what was going on there. And there is a lot of truth in that most of the Northern Ireland Committee were either members of the Communist Party or travellers with the Communist Party. And they did not wish to push the vote out in relation to the Protestant working class, in relation to civil rights. And the Northern Ireland Labour Party were exactly the same. And that's a fact from my point of view. But you did comment, and this is where I would like you to say something. You mentioned Michael Farrell and Kevin Boyle being on the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. You said they left. Have you any comment on what they did after they left? Do you think, is there any truth that they liaised and cooperated with the Provisional Sinn Féin as they became to form Northern Resistance in opposition to the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association? And if you do, what were the motives?
Yeah, I just don't know enough about it. I know that there was a certain collusion between organisations, but as to their particular role in it, I don't know.
My memory is that Kevin Boyle disappeared very quickly after the split in the civil rights movement and the violence of '69. He just went into an academic career. Michael Farrell, with Frank McManus, with Bernadette Devlin, with a very broad-based, mainly nationalist organisation, emerged after internment. Remember, Northern Resistance emerged after internment.
They did make moment too.
Yeah, it was very much Romain Enniskillen, Uri, nationalist areas, and they were much more of a nationalist opposition to unionism after internment. That's absolutely true. And Michael Farrell was a member of that, certainly. Beg your pardon?
Just want to speak a little bit about the PD. I was in the PD, and I was in the PD because I was a Derry person who would have been in the civil rights movement here, but I was based in Belfast. I was a student at the time, and I wasn't looking for a revolution. I was looking for civil rights the same as everybody else. And with regard to the Burntolland March and the Long March, again, the same thing applied. There was a mixture of people from political backgrounds in the PD, the same as there was in the civil rights movement. Some had some experience, some were Trotskyists, some were in the Labour Party, some were in various things. But overall, people were simply looking for equality. And if you look at the careers of people like Michael Farrell and Kevin Boyle, and a great deal of the people who were in the PD, their lives afterwards showed what egalitarian, libertarian, human rights people they were, how fair they were. And the march, the Long March, wasn't looking to provoke sectarianism. It shouldn't have been possible for the police to allow people to attack a march simply because you were there. That shouldn't have happened in the state. And it wasn't the march that caused that. It was the police colluding with people who shouldn't have been allowed to attack the march. And I just want to correct that. You know, the thing about that people were looking for revolution and were therefore totally provocative. I didn't feel like that. And I did look for inspiration and did take inspiration from the American movement. And yes, Harold Wilson had an aura of someone who'd come from the working class perhaps and had managed maybe as a grammar school boy or something to get to where he was, and therefore maybe it was a nicer climate in which to be protesting. But certainly people were looking to America and copying. And actually some of the people from America came over and spoke to us and you know, were around. So that's my...
Any other points anybody wants to raise? Have we somebody down there? Sorry, Jim himself.
Eamon, just a question for yourself. You alluded upon your speech. In the end of January '65, the motorcades held to Stormont, which united both communities here to protest about the decision to put the new University of Korea in the Unionstown. But 3 weeks later, on February 15, 1965, William Craig, who was the Labour Duke Street, made a decision to shut down the so-called Derry line, serving the line from Derry, Strabane, Omagh, Newton Stewart, Carrymore, Dungannon, Portadown, the last major railway closure in Northern Ireland, leaving only 3 railway stations open to this day west of the River Van, and that's because they serve nationalist areas, a purely sectarian decision. But Sheila Murrahan warned, the Liberal MP Goretti alluded to earlier, warned in 264 that this would lead to violence, social, economic, and a violent reaction. To what extent do you think her prophecy came true 3 years later?
Well, certainly that was the Bennett report in 1963, which had outlined the closure of the railways west of the Bann. The government didn't have to act on it. This is the time of Craigavon, the new city with a provocative name. Also great concern in North Armagh among the unionist sort of establishment that lots of nationalists would arrive in Craigavon from Fermanagh and Tyrone. They're very concerned about they would suddenly destabilise County Armagh as a unionist area. See, a lot of sectarian thinking going on at that time. Just as Eddie McAteer and his colleagues assumed the role of official opposition, and Sean Lemass tells them to raise discrimination and so on at Stormont, which is what Brooke had been saying in his defence of the sort of injustices claimed by nationalists. He said that no, they need to raise these in Stormont. These are older members of the Nationalist Party raising hoary old chestnuts that everybody's forgotten about, like Brooke wrote, for example, gerrymandering. This is 1962. So you have all of that going on. Certainly, it's a major decision. I think it's reinforced, though, locally by the university decision. As you say, the campaign for a university in Derry was cross-community, from Claude Wilton, a Liberal, to, the unionist mayor, Albert Anderson, who became something of a hate figure for civil rights leaders later on, but he was certainly one of those who backed the campaign for Derry, a young John Hume in a tweed jacket, the cavalcade to Stormont. And of course, the MP for the city of Derry actually voted against the local decision. He voted against the University for Derry. It's even worse because when you look at the detail, the Unionist cabinet wanted to site the second university not in Coleraine at all, but in Portadown. They wanted it in Portadown. And Coleraine was a kind of a compromise. So it seems incredible that sort of narrow thinking, apart from the fact Portadown was hardly 30 miles from Belfast. But I mean, it was going to be near the city of Craigavon. This was the second university. So there was certainly a decision, and you can see if you read back into the Unionist archives of the mid-1950s, the campaign against investment in the city by, leading members of the establishment, leading members of the special commandants and so on, going to Brookborough, read his diaries, and they say, we don't want investment in the city. That's the last thing we want. We don't want industries. There's enough jobs for our people. We don't want to give jobs to the disloyalists. And really, you could draw a line from that. So certainly, I think the failure, really, when you look at the tragedies of the whole period, the Nelsonite policy of Westminster from 1922, the failure of Labour when it, in its days of power and subsidisation of the new welfare state in a poor region, to assert itself and to demand normal standards. This was a left-wing Labour government. And then finally, the Tories, people like Rab Butler, who had a sense of history. He was a Cambridge historian. And he met the nationalists, whom he had been told in advance he didn't have to meet. He met them. They gave him chapter and verse. He just handed it straight to Stormont. This had happened in the 30s as well with Stanley Baldwin. There was a reluctance to get engaged. And one interesting thing I'll just add to that came out of our discussion last week, the first session in Belfast, Russell Rees, the historian of that Labour government and Northern Ireland, and how it shirked the Northern Ireland issue. He said that the one thing that irked Harold Wilson, not the denial of civil rights, the denial of the universal suffrage in Northern Ireland, was the fact that there were 12 Unionist MPs until Gerry Fitt was elected in 1966, who were threatening, they had threatened the previous Labour parties, revolution in 1945. They'd voted against the welfare state, free education, family allowances, everything, with the Tories. And in 1966, that group of 11 MPs by that stage were still trying to undermine Wilson's minority government. And a week after the 5th of October 1968, Jerry Fitt, who had gathered this support group around him, trenchantly demanding civil rights, got up and asked the British government, asked Harold Wilson, what are you going to do about this? And Captain Orr got up, Captain Lawrence Percy Story Orr, the Grand Master of the Black Institution, or the MP for South Down. And he began to say, to defend unionism. And Wilson turned on him right away. And he said, we've listened to you people here for 50 years, but we've seen on British television what happened in Derry. And you could see the anger welling up in Wilson, that he'd been frustrated by Ulster Unionists from getting his programme through. And that was as important a factor in many ways. But you are right. I mean, the dragon's teeth were being sown, and that social welfare and educational reform of the late 40s had an impact that unionism could not have foretold. And that emerges really in the civil rights movement in the 50s. 60s. I'm a child of the 70s. Yes. Are we happy enough? One last point, I think, this gentleman in the blue.
First thing I'd like to say is my wife is delighted that there's another Cork woman here tonight. I'm from the county myself, from a place called Garba. But I've been reading quite a bit about the civil rights campaign over the past couple of years. And it got me interested in what happened before. I found this a very good book, so I would like to recommend it to everyone. And what struck me, or what strikes me when I read about the civil rights, and I read about some of the conflicts in the north from 1900s onwards, especially from 1912 onwards, the language being used by certain elements within unionism in, say, 1912 and 1968, and today, you could substitute it in any period of time. I'd like to know what you think of that. Has unionism, how far has unionism moved in 100 years? And my next point is this: what is nationalism's next step? And Goretti, this to yourself, is this the occasion where the women of the North really step forward? And can women have a major role to play in what happens next within the 6 counties?
Would you like to start? There's a woman's question there for you, Goretti.
Okay, so first of all, just in terms of what you were saying about, the language being very much the same, maybe even in some ways in terms of policy today, I was really struck by what Eamon was saying about the social welfare, the family allowances, and the unionists actually wanting to sort of keep those to 3 children. Well, whenever the welfare reform bill that's now got, that's now law, was in the Assembly in 2012, I had the honour to do a child impact assessment for Nikki, for the Children's Commissioner, about that. And Nelson McCausland, who was the minister in charge at the time, so I pointed out, that if they were to bring in these benefit caps, that it would mean that our larger families here in the north would actually really suffer more than any other part of these islands, because it would mean that essentially, as is now the case, that you'd only get money for 2 children. And then it was 3, but they brought it down since. Basically McCausland just kind of said, well, you shouldn't be having these children if you can't afford them, as if we all sort of plan our children in a way that assumes, that your husband's going to lose his job or heaven forbid, lose his life, So that view sort of remains, and actually it doesn't actually make sense in terms of demography, because the largest families in Northern Ireland these days aren't Catholic working class families, they're Protestant middle class families, but anyway, there was no point in telling him that. But to get back to your question about, whether the women are going to lead to this, lead to the sort of next step, I mean, it was really interesting last year, after the rugby rape trial, to see the demonstrations in the south of Ireland, effectively almost spontaneous really, because they happened in the couple of days straight after the verdict, where there was thousands on the streets, not just in Dublin, but in Galway, in Cork, and in Waterford, and with people demonstrating about a jurisdiction that they didn't belong to. Where actually in the south, the whole way in which rape cases are handled is much better than up here. There's total anonymity for both the woman and the defendant. There's, I'm assuming it was a woman, sorry, for the complainant and the defendant. And there's no reporting at all of rape cases until they're over. And the fact that actually people were taken to the streets, the women, mainly women, and some men, taken to the streets in the way they were. I mean, actually, Eamon McCann pointed out, he had this phrase afterwards, which I've been using ever since, which is, it wasn't a demonstration for a united Ireland, it was a demonstration of a united Ireland. And I do think I keep on saying this to my friends when they say, what's going to happen, with the border and everything? I ask the question, who knew in July of 1989 that the Berlin Wall would be down by the end of October of 1989? I actually have a friend who's East German, a colleague in Queen's, and I asked him one day, I said, tell me, Dirk, when did you know that the wall was going to come down? He said, I didn't know on the morning that it came down. I didn't know it was going to come down that night. And I do actually think that it may well be that the demands of the women in the north who are just kind of saying, are we really getting left the only bit of these islands where we are not considered people enough to be able to have control over our own bodies? Is that really what's happening here? And that at some stage everybody's just going to go, right, we're just not having it, we're joining, we're going to do something different, and whatever that different is. I hope that's the way it goes. I hope that it's not a case of, a border poll where 51% or 50% plus one, votes one way or the other, and we have a kind of Brexit situation then where everybody just hates everybody. I do hope that it's either something that's very spontaneous, where, it's a kind of a people power type thing, as it was in Germany, or if it's not that we have the kind of deliberations that you see in the south, with citizens' assemblies and stuff like that before there's any vote. If you look at, did anybody think this time last year, all right, yeah, did anybody think this time last year that we could have had 2/3 of people in the south of Ireland voting for quite a liberal abortion regime? We would have thought that it was impossible. The only reason it was possible is because people knew exactly what they were voting for. It had all been worked out in advance. There was heads of legislation and everything. People were really, really clear what they were getting and what they weren't getting. And I think that if we don't have that, I hope that you're right and that the women do lead it, because I think women would say, no lads, we can't just do this quickly. We have to plan these things, that's why we try to organise things like summer holidays and stuff, in March or April, and not wait until, the start of July to go looking for a place in Donegal when they're all gone. So women would say that's the kind of thing that you need to be doing, and not kind of Boris Johnson type.
Emmet, have you a thought on the wider question, just on the language of unionism over the last 100 years?
Yeah, as to what people wanted of civil rights movement, I think there were various elements in it. I think some people like Roy Johnson and so on hoped that it would lead to reform in Northern Ireland, and that the kind of Marx's kind of explanation of unionism was that it was based on privilege. So you took away the privilege, and then there was no reason for the Protestant Catholic working class to come together on a class basis. And they believed then that the next step would be to push on to, the sort of sensible way forward would be some kind of workers' republic. Then there were other people, maybe a majority of the rank and file, certainly, but there were other people who just wanted, fairer jobs and houses and so on, and really weren't thinking beyond that,
On the question of language, clearly James Craig, who became Prime Minister for 20 years, who said a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state, he was a man who in 1906, after a military career going into politics, saw the need for a homeland. If Home Rule became law, there was a Catholic-dominated Parliament in Dublin, then his people would opt out. There would be a homeland. He achieves that in 1920-22. in the six-county state. The language is very much, of course, that of the siege mentality, a sense that hereditary enemies, and that's used by both sides at that time, their hereditary enemies would be supreme over them. For unionism, the McCann case of 1910, infused by the Ne Temere decree issued by the Pope in 1908 on mixed marriages, children brought up in the Roman Catholic tradition. That was a big thing. I mean, Mrs. McCann became the greatest asset to unionism at that time, the Ulster crisis, since William of Orange, one nationalist said. But the other problem was that the great hope had been 1798. Catholic, Protestant and dissenter, a political identity like they have in France. You didn't have to belong to, you could be a Palatine from the German Rhineland in Limerick, or a Huguenot, or you could be Ulster Scots, or you could be Gaelic Irish or Old English, but you were all going to come together in this new nation. Now that's defeated in 1798. It is marred by sectarianism in Wexford in the south. As nationalism develops in the 19th century, it's very much a sectarian project under Daniel O'Connell. Even though he has Protestant friends who back repeal, who back Catholic emancipation, there's very little attempt outside the revolutionaries, the Young Irelanders and people, to take account of the other tradition, mainly in the northeast. And therefore, an opportunity is missed around the Land League, for example, the demand for the land north and south, tenant right in the north. And yet in areas of Ulster, like North Tyrone, we're just coming up in the car about the Protestant Home Rulers of Donamana and Castlederg, who returned to Home Rule MP down to 1918. Yet that would be seen as a very divided area today. The route in North Antrim, where the Reverend J.B. Armour saw an eviction, led 500 Protestant Home Rulers in Ballymoney Town Hall in 1913, or less than half the people of the Ards of County Down, Newton Ards, signed the Covenant, a hangover from 98. But nothing was done to kind of harness that and, kind of address those fears and all of that. And of course, we're in the same situation today, because you could say the Good Friday Agreement, while on paper it tried to create a great new dawn, a brand new world, it hasn't really been reflected in practice. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Can I just thank the Mayor, before we leave, thank the Mayor, John Boyle, for making this room available for his hospitality this evening, the Community Relations Council for funding it, our speakers, Goretti and Emmet, who have been marvellous here tonight, and for Deirdre McBride, who helped to organise as well, and yourselves for coming. Thank you very much.